The sun had not yet cleared the horizon when the heavy iron gates of the Naval Training Center groaned open. A battered, rust-colored pickup truck rattled through the entrance, its engine coughing in the cool morning air. Behind the wheel sat Arthur, a man who looked like he had been carved out of a piece of old oak. He was 72 years old, though his hands, thick and permanently stained with the gray grease of machinery, looked even older. Arthur parked in the furthest corner of the lot, away from the sleek SUVs and sports cars owned by the younger officers. He climbed out slowly, his knees popping with a sound like dried twigs breaking. He didn't mind the ache. To him, the pain was just a reminder that he was still upright. He reached into the bed of the truck and pulled out a worn canvas bag filled with wrenches, screwdrivers, and a roll of duct tape that had seen better days. He walked toward the main maintenance building, his head down, eyes fixed on the pavement. He didn't need to look up to know where he was going. He had walked this path every morning for the last 12 years. To the hundreds of sailors and high-ranking officials who hurried past him, Arthur was part of the architecture. He was as much a fixture of the base as the flagpoles or the concrete barriers. He was the man who fixed the toilets that overflowed, the man who replaced the humming fluorescent bulbs, and the man who scraped the gum off the bottom of the cafeteria tables. As he entered the hangar, the air was already thick with the smell of jet fuel and the sound of shouting. A group of young recruits was running drills, their boots thumping rhythmically against the polished floor. They were young, strong, and full of the kind of confidence that only comes from having never truly been tested. Arthur stepped to the side to let them pass. Not one of them looked at him. To them, he was just a janitor, a ghost in blue coveralls who existed only to clean up their messes. Arthur didn't take it personally. In fact, he preferred it that way. He liked the quiet. He liked the way he could drift through the halls of power and hear the secrets of the base without anyone ever wondering if he was listening. He made his way to the basement, a labyrinth of pipes and buzzing electrical panels. This was his kingdom. Down here, amongst the hiss of steam and the throb of the water heaters, Arthur felt at home. He set his bag down on a wooden workbench that he had built himself. On the wall above it, there were no photos of his family, no awards, and certainly no hint of the life he had led before he became Artie, the maintenance guy. His first task of the day was a stubborn leak in the ceiling of the officers' lounge. It was a high-traffic area, which meant he would have to deal with people. Arthur sighed, grabbed his ladder, and headed back upstairs. The lounge was filled with a low murmur of conversation. Several men in crisp uniforms sat in leather chairs, sipping coffee and discussing logistics. Arthur moved to the corner where a dark water stain was blossoming on the ceiling tiles. He set up his ladder with practiced ease, making as little noise as possible. As he climbed, he felt the familiar weight of eyes on him. Not eyes of interest, but eyes of mild annoyance. He was an obstacle, a minor inconvenience in their morning routine. "Hey, Pops," a young officer called out without looking up from his tablet. "Try not to drop any of that ceiling dust in my coffee, all right?" Arthur didn't look back. "Yes, sir," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. He pulled out a utility knife and began to cut away the damp tile. Above him, a network of copper pipes gleamed in the dim light. He found the source of the leak almost immediately, a hairline crack in a joint. It was a simple fix, but it required steady hands. As he worked, a group of senior officers entered the room. Their voices were louder, more commanding. They were talking about a new arrival, a specialist who was coming in to lead a high-stakes training seminar. "I heard he's one of the youngest to ever make commander in the special teams," one officer said. "Tough as nails. Doesn't care for formalities much, just results." Arthur continued to tighten the valve, his mind drifting. He had heard these kinds of stories 1,000 times. Every few months, a rising star would come through the base, convinced they were the toughest thing to ever walk the earth. Arthur had seen them come and he had seen them go. He had seen them break under the pressure of real combat, and he had seen them return home as changed men or not return at all. He finished the repair and began to pack his tools. Just as he was descending the ladder, a sudden commotion broke out near the entrance of the lounge. The heavy double doors swung open, and a man walked in who seemed to command the very air in the room. He wasn't particularly tall, but he moved with a fluid, predatory grace that made everyone else in the room look like they were moving in slow motion. The room went silent. This was the man they had been talking about. Arthur didn't stop to look. He folded his ladder, slung his heavy canvas bag over his shoulder, and began to shuffle toward the exit. He kept his gaze on the floor, his shoulders hunched as if to take up as little space as possible. He was halfway to the door when he tripped slightly over a rogue power cord. His bag shifted, and his sleeve, which had been rolled up to his elbows for work, rode up higher on his forearm. Arthur didn't notice. He just adjusted his grip and kept walking. He was focused on getting back to the basement, back to the silence of the pipes. He didn't notice the way the new commander's eyes suddenly locked onto his arm. He didn't see the man's expression shift from professional indifference to absolute, bone-deep shock. To everyone else in the room, Arthur was just a tired old man finishing a shift. He was a nobody. He was the help. He was the guy you called when the sink was backed up. Arthur pushed open the door and stepped back out into the hallway. The cool air hit his face, and he took a deep breath. He had survived another morning in the real world. Now he could go back to his tools. But as the door swung shut behind him, he heard a chair scrape harshly against the floor inside. He heard the sound of fast, heavy footsteps, not the casual stroll of an officer, but the purposeful stride of a soldier on a mission. Arthur didn't turn around. He just kept walking, his boots clicking softly on the linoleum. He didn't know that behind him, the world he had worked so hard to leave behind was about to catch up with him in the most public way possible. He didn't know that the simple ink on his arm, a mark he usually kept hidden under layers of flannel and denim, had just been spotted by the one person on base who knew exactly what it meant. He reached the elevator and pressed the button for the basement. As the doors began to slide shut, he caught a glimpse of a figure rounding the corner of the hallway, moving fast. Arthur sighed and leaned his head against the cool metal wall of the elevator. Just another day, he whispered to himself. He was wrong. It was the last day he would ever be invisible. The basement of the training center was a world of shadows and humming machinery. For Arthur, this was where he felt safest. Down here, the pipes didn't care about rank, and the boilers didn't ask for stories. He set his ladder against the brick wall and let out a long, shaky breath. His heart was drumming a bit faster than usual, a lingering effect of the crowded lounge upstairs. He hated being around too many people. It made his skin crawl like a storm was brewing just over the horizon. He walked over to his small workbench and picked up a rag. He began to wipe down his tools with a slow, rhythmic motion. Each wrench and pliers had its place. He treated them with more respect than most people treated each other. They were reliable. They did exactly what they were designed to do. As he worked, his mind drifted back to the young man who had walked into the lounge. He had seen that look before, the way the man carried himself, the way his eyes scanned the room like he was looking for exits and threats all at once. That man wasn't just a sailor. He was a predator. Arthur knew that look because, a lifetime ago, he had seen it in his own mirror. But that mirror had been broken a long time ago, and he had buried the shards deep in the dirt of a country halfway across the world. He looked down at his forearm. The sleeve of his coveralls had slipped down, covering the faded blue ink. He reached out and pulled the fabric even tighter, buttoning the cuff despite the heat of the basement. That mark was a curse and a ghost. It was a symbol of a brotherhood that mostly lived underground now, in cemeteries or in the dark corners of lonely rooms. Suddenly, the heavy steel door at the top of the basement stairs groaned open. A shaft of bright, artificial light cut through the gloom. Arthur froze. Usually, nobody came down here. If something was broken, they called him on the radio. They didn't come looking for him. He heard footsteps. They weren't the heavy, clomping boots of a maintenance worker or the hurried shuffle of a clerk. These steps were light, deliberate, and perfectly spaced. They were the steps of someone who was trained to move through the jungle without snapping a single twig. Arthur didn't turn around. He kept his back to the stairs, focusing on a stubborn spot of grease on his workbench. "It's a long way from the Delta to a basement in Virginia, isn't it?" The voice was calm, but it had an edge like a razor blade. It was the man from the lounge, the new commander. Arthur felt a chill run down his spine that had nothing to do with the damp air. He took a slow breath, trying to keep his hands from trembling. "I don't know what you're talking about, sir," Arthur said, his voice sounding thinner than he wanted. "I'm just here to fix the heater. It's been acting up since Tuesday." The footsteps came closer, stopping just a few feet behind him. Arthur could feel the man's presence. It was like standing near a high-voltage wire. There was a vibrating energy coming off him, a focused intensity that demanded attention. "The heater can wait," the man said. "I saw the ink, Arthur. I saw the three-pointed spear. There are only 6 men left in the world who carry that specific mark. 4 of them are in the ground. 1 is in a veterans hospital in San Diego. That leaves 1. Arthur finally turned around. He wiped his hands on his greasy rag, trying to maintain his arty persona, the tired, slightly confused old man. He looked at the commander. The younger man was standing perfectly still, his hands behind his back. His uniform was flawless, but it was his eyes that caught Arthur. They weren't looking at a maintenance man. They were looking at a legend. "You've got me confused with someone else, Commander," Arthur said, forced a small, awkward laugh. "This tattoo? I got this in a port in Thailand when I was 19 and had too much to drink. Most of us did back then. It doesn't mean anything." The commander didn't blink. He didn't smile. He stepped forward, entering the small circle of light above Arthur's workbench. "My father was at the docks in '72, the commander whispered. "He told me about a man who stayed behind when the last boat pulled out. He told me about a man who swam 3 miles in the dark with a wounded comrade on his back while the whole coastline was on fire. He said that man had a spear on his arm and eyes like a hawk." Arthur felt the walls of the basement closing in. The memories he had spent 40 years pushing down began to bubble to the surface. He could almost smell the salt air and the copper scent of blood. He could hear the screaming of the jets overhead. He shook his head violently, as if he could shake the images away. "Your father had a vivid imagination," Arthur snapped. The softness was gone from his voice. For a second, the gravelly rumble sounded like a command. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I have work to do. This base doesn't run on stories. It runs on steam and electricity." He turned back to his workbench, his heart hammering against his ribs. He wanted the man to leave. He wanted to go back to being invisible. He wanted to be the guy who fixed the toilets again. But the commander didn't move. "They think you're a ghost, you know. The Pentagon files say you disappeared in '75. They think you checked out. But here you are, fixing pipes for kids who aren't even old enough to know your name." Arthur gripped the edge of the workbench so hard his knuckles turned white. "It's a good job," he muttered. "It's quiet. People leave me alone." "Because they don't know who you are," the commander said. "But I know. And pretty soon, they're going to know too." "Don't," Arthur said. And this time it wasn't a plea. It was a warning. He turned to face the younger man again, and for the first time, he stood up straight. His shoulders squared, his chin lifted, and the hunch in his back seemed to vanish. In that moment, he wasn't 72. He was a warrior in his prime, standing his ground. The commander's eyes widened slightly. He saw the shift. He saw the ghost come to life. He realized that the man in front of him wasn't just a veteran. He was a weapon that had simply been put in storage. "I didn't come here to blow your cover, sir," the commander said, his voice dropping an octave in respect. "I came here because I wanted to see if the stories were true. I wanted to see if a man could really walk away from all that glory and just fade away." "There is no glory in it," Arthur said quietly. "There's just the work. And when the work is done, you find something else to do. I found this." He gestured to the dusty basement. The commander looked around the dim room, then back at Arthur. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small silver coin, Manila challenge coin, with the emblem of the elite teams. He set it quietly on the wooden workbench next to Arthur's wrench. "The training seminar starts at 10 o'clock in the main auditorium," the commander said. "I'm supposed to talk to these kids about what it means to be a hero. I'd be honored if you were there. Not on the stage, just in the room." Arthur looked at the coin. "I've got a clogged drain in the gym. It'll take me all morning." The commander nodded, a small, knowing smile playing on his lips. He snapped a sharp, silent salute, not a formal one for the cameras, but a quick flick of the hand between two men who understood the cost of the life they had chosen. Then he turned and walked back toward the stairs. Arthur watched him go, the light from the doorway framing his silhouette before the heavy steel door clicked shut, plunging the basement back into its familiar, humming gloom. Arthur stood in the silence for a long time. He looked at the silver coin gleaming on his workbench. He looked at his stained hands. For years, he had been running from the man he used to be. But as he reached out and touched the cool metal of the coin, he realized that you can bury a secret as deep as you want, but the truth has a way of rising to the surface, just like a leak in a pipe that eventually finds its way through the ceiling. He picked up the coin and tucked it into his pocket. He had a choice to make. He could stay in the basement, or he could walk into the light. The morning air inside the base felt heavier than usual. Arthur sat on a wooden stool in his basement workshop, staring at the silver coin the commander had left behind. In the quiet of the underground, the coin seemed to glow under the single light bulb hanging from the ceiling. He felt a strange tug in his chest, a feeling he hadn't felt in decades. It was the feeling of being seen. For years, his invisibility had been his armor, but that armor now had a massive crack in it. He looked at the clock on the wall. It was 9:45 a.m. The seminar was starting soon. Arthur stood up and walked over to a cracked mirror tucked behind some old pipes. He looked at his reflection. He saw a man who had spent 40 years trying to blend into the shadows. He saw the wrinkles around his eyes and the gray stubble on his chin. He looked like any other grandfather you might pass on the street. But as he stood there, he slowly straightened his spine. He pulled his shoulders back. The transformation was subtle, but the man staring back in the mirror suddenly looked less like a janitor and more like a mountain. He didn't change his clothes. He wore his blue maintenance coveralls, the ones with Artie stitched in small white letters over the pocket. He grabbed his toolbox, not because he had a job to do, but because it was his shield. If anyone asked why he was there, he could just say he was checking the vents. The main auditorium was a massive, tiered room filled with rows of young men and women in pristine uniforms. The air smelled of floor wax and nervous energy. These were the best of the best, the future leaders of the fleet. They sat with their backs straight and their eyes forward, waiting for the legendary commander to speak. Arthur slipped through a side door at the very back of the room. He stayed in the shadows, leaning against the cold brick wall. He kept his toolbox at his feet. From this vantage point, he could see everything. He saw the young officer from the lounge, the one who had warned him about dropping dust in his coffee. The boy was sitting in the third row, looking bored and checking his watch. At exactly 10 a.m., the lights dimmed. The commander walked onto the stage. He didn't have a microphone, and he didn't need one. His voice carried to every corner of the room with an authority that made the air feel still. "You are all here because you think you are tough," the commander began, his eyes roaming the crowd. "You have passed the tests. You have the physical strength. You have the gear. But most of you have no idea what it actually means to serve." A murmur ran through the rows of students. They looked at each other, confused. This wasn't the typical pep talk they expected. "Real service," the commander continued, "isn't about the medals you wear on your chest. It isn't about the photos in the newspaper or the way people look at you in your dress whites. Real service is silent. It is the man who does the job when no one is watching. It is the man who carries the weight so that others don't have to feel it." Arthur watched from the back, his heart thumping slowly. He knew exactly what the commander was doing, and it made him want to bolt for the exit. The commander paced the stage, his boots echoing in the silent room. "We talk about legends in our community. We talk about the giants whose shoulders we stand on. We study their tactics. We memorize their names. But what if I told you that one of those giants is in this room right now?" Every head in the auditorium turned. People looked toward the high-ranking officers in the front row. They looked at the instructors. No one looked at the back of the room. No one looked at the old man in the grease-stained coveralls. "There is a man among us," the commander said, his voice dropping to a low, respectful tone, "who walked through fire before most of your parents were born. He never asked for a thank you. He never asked for a pension. He just finished his mission and went to work, serving his country in a different way, by making sure the lights stayed on and the water stayed hot for the next generation." The commander looked directly at the back of the room. He didn't point, but his gaze was like a spotlight. Arthur felt a bead of sweat roll down his neck. He wanted to disappear. He wanted the floor to open up and swallow him whole. But he didn't move. He stood his ground, his hand gripping the handle of his toolbox. The young officer from the lounge turned around in his seat, following the commander's gaze. When he saw Arthur standing there, his face went pale. He remembered his comment about the coffee. He remembered the way he had looked at Arthur like he was a piece of furniture. He looked back at the commander, then back at Arthur, his mouth hanging open in realization. "A few hours ago," the commander said, "I saw a mark on a man's arm. It was a mark that represents a level of bravery that most of us will never even see, let alone achieve. And yet, when I spoke to this man, he told me he was just a maintenance worker. He told me he was just doing his job." The silence in the room was now absolute. You could hear the hum of the air conditioning. The recruits were leaning forward, their eyes searching the shadows. "Stand up," the commander said. It wasn't a request, it was a command, but it was delivered with more respect than a king would receive. Arthur hesitated. For 40 years he had lived in the quiet. He had enjoyed the peace of being nobody. If he stood up now, that peace would be gone forever. He thought about the basement. He thought about his rusty truck. Then, he thought about the men he had lost. The ones who didn't get to grow old and hide in basements. He realized he wasn't doing this for himself. He was doing it for them. Arthur let go of his toolbox. He took a step out of the shadows and into the light of the hallway. The commander snapped to attention. His heels clicked together with a sharp crack that echoed like a gunshot. His hand went to his brow in a perfect, rigid salute. For a second, the students didn't know what to do. Then, like a wave, it happened. The front row stood up, then the second, then the third. The sound of hundreds of chairs scraping at once was deafening. Every single person in that room, from the bored recruits to the hardened instructors, turned toward the back of the room and stood at attention. The young officer who had been rude to Arthur was the most rigid of all. His eyes were wide, filled with a mix of shame and awe. Arthur stood there, surrounded by the salute of the elite. He didn't have a uniform. He didn't have his medals. He just had his stained blue coveralls and the silver coin in his pocket. He didn't salute back. Instead, he did something more powerful. He looked each of the young recruits in the eye as they stood there. He gave them a single gall, slow nod, a passing of the torch. In that moment, the maintenance guy was gone. The legend was standing in his place. The air in the auditorium felt like it had been electrified. Arthur stood there for what felt like an eternity, looking at the hundreds of young faces staring back at him with newfound respect. He didn't stay long. He wasn't a man who enjoyed a spotlight. With one last look at the commander, Arthur turned and walked back through the side door, his boots heavy on the linoleum. He didn't go back to his basement immediately. He walked out of the building and stood in the fresh air, leaning against a brick pillar. His hands were shaking. It wasn't fear. It was the weight of the past crashing into the present. For decades, he had built a wall around his history, and today, that wall had been knocked down with a single salute. As he stood there, the double doors of the auditorium swung open. A group of recruits came out, talking in hushed, hurried whispers. When they saw Arthur, the conversation stopped instantly. They didn't walk past him this time. They didn't look through him. They stopped several feet away, standing a little straighter, their eyes wide. One young man, the same one who had made the comment about the ceiling dust in the lounge earlier that morning, stepped forward. His face was bright red, and he looked like he wanted to crawl into a hole. He stopped in front of Arthur and removed his cap, holding it nervously in his hands. "Sir," the young man began, his voice cracking, I didn't know. I mean, it's no excuse for being disrespectful to anyone. But I am so sorry for how I spoke to you this morning. I had no idea who I was standing next to." Arthur looked at the boy. He saw the genuine shame in his eyes. He remembered being that age, full of energy, feeling invincible, and often forgetting that the world didn't revolve around him. Arthur reached out a calloused, grease-stained hand and placed it on the young man's shoulder. "The pipes don't care who I am, son," Arthur said softly, "and neither does the dirt. You treat everyone with respect because you don't know what kind of war they're fighting inside. Remember that, and you'll be a better leader than most." The recruit nodded vigorously, unable to find more words. He gave a small, respectful bow of his head and stepped back, allowing Arthur to pass. As Arthur made his way across the base toward the maintenance shed, the atmosphere had completely shifted. News on a military base travels faster than a jet engine. By the time he reached the motor pool, the mechanics had stopped working. They stood by their toolboxes, watching him walk by. Some gave a quiet nod. Others simply watched in silence. He wasn't Artie anymore. He was the man with the tattoo. He was the ghost who had come back to life. When he finally reached his basement office, he found someone waiting for him. It wasn't the commander this time. It was the base superintendent, a man named Henderson who usually only spoke to Arthur when the budget was being cut or a major water line had burst. Henderson was sitting on the edge of Arthur's workbench, looking at the old photos of the base's history that hung in the hallway. "Arthur," Henderson said, standing up. He sounded awkward, as if he didn't quite know how to address the man he had treated like a servant for 10 years. I just got a call from the commander's office. He told me some things. Things that aren't in your HR file. Arthur sat down on his wooden stool and picked up a screwdriver, turning it over in his hands. I didn't put them in the file for a reason, Henderson. I wanted a job, not a parade. I understand that, Henderson said, leaning against the wall. But the word is out now. I've got officers asking why a Navy Cross recipient is hauling trash and fixing leaks. They think it's a disgrace. They want to move you to an advisory role, maybe put you in a suit and have you talk to the new guys. Arthur looked up, his eyes sharp and clear. I don't want a suit. And I don't want to talk. I like the work. My hands know how to fix things. My mind knows how to deal with machines. People are complicated. Machines are simple. Henderson sighed. Arthur, you can't go back to just being the maintenance guy. Not after today. The recruits won't let you. The officers won't let you. Then let them learn, Arthur replied. Let them learn that service doesn't end when you take off the uniform. Let them see that there's no shame in honest labor. If they want to honor me, they can let me finish fixing that boiler in Building B. It's been rattling for 3 days. Henderson looked at Arthur for a long time. He saw the stubborn set of the old man's jaw. He realized that Arthur wasn't being humble. He was being himself. The same discipline that had made him a hero in the jungle was the discipline that made him a master of his craft in the basement. All right, Henderson said, reaching out to shake Arthur's hand. This time, the handshake was firm and lingered for a second. I'll tell them you're staying where you are. But don't be surprised if your work orders start including a lot of requests for technical advice from the higher-ups. Henderson left, and silence returned to the basement. But it was a different kind of silence, the weight that Arthur had been carrying. The secret he had been guarding was gone. He felt lighter, even though he knew his life was about to become a lot more complicated. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the silver coin. He placed it on the workbench, right next to his favorite wrench. He realized that he didn't have to choose between being a warrior and being a maintenance man. He was both. He stood up, grabbed his heavy tool bag, and headed for the stairs. He had a boiler to fix. As he climbed the stairs, he heard a sound from the hangar above. It was the sound of a group of sailors. Usually, they would be shouting and joking, but as Arthur emerged from the basement, the noise died down. A young woman in fatigues was standing by the door. She saw Arthur and immediately moved to hold the door open for him. She didn't say anything, but the look in her eyes was one of pure, unadulterated admiration. Arthur walked through the door, his head held a little higher than it had been that morning. He knew that the days of being a ghost were over. He was a living piece of history now, a bridge between the old world and the new. And as he walked toward Building B, he realized that perhaps this was his final mission, not to fight a war, but to show these young sailors that the true heart of a hero is found in the quiet moments of duty, long after the shouting is stopped. The following weeks on the base were unlike anything Arthur had experienced in his 12 years of service there. The secret was out, but it didn't manifest in the way he had feared. There were no cameras, no loud ceremonies, and no prying journalists. Instead, there was a quiet, profound shift in the atmosphere. It was as if the soul of the base had recalibrated itself around the old man in the blue coveralls. Arthur continued his routine. He still arrived at the crack of dawn in his rusty pickup truck. He still brewed his bitter coffee in the basement. But now, when he walked through the halls, the world seemed to tilt in his direction. It wasn't just the salutes, though those happened often, even from officers who outranked everyone on the base. It was the way people spoke to him. The dismissive, "Hey, Pops," was gone, replaced by a soft, respectful, "Good morning, sir." "Or can I give you a hand with that ladder, Mr. Arthur?" He usually declined the help with a small smile, but he stopped ignoring the people around him. He realized that, by hiding himself, he had been denying these young sailors something important. They needed to see that a life of service didn't have to end in bitterness or a desperate search for fame. It could end in a quiet, dignified peace. One Tuesday afternoon, Arthur was sitting on a bench outside the training wing, taking a break from repairing a heavy industrial fan. He was wiping the sweat from his forehead when he noticed a young sailor sitting a few feet away. The boy looked exhausted, his head in his hands, his uniform dusty from the obstacle course. Arthur recognized the look. It was the look of someone who had hit the wall. Someone who had hit the wall. Someone who was wondering if they had what it took to stay. Arthur reached into his lunch pail, pulled out an extra apple, and tossed it toward the boy. The sailor caught it out of reflex, startled. He looked at Arthur, his eyes widening as he realized who was sitting next to him. "Thank you, sir," the boy stammered. "Sit easy, son," Arthur said, his voice like the low hum of a transformer. "You're leaning too hard on your own shoulders. That's how you break." The sailor took a bite of the apple, some of the tension leaving his frame. It's harder than I thought it would be. Sometimes I feel like I'm just playing a part, like I'm not really one of them." Arthur looked out across the parade ground, his eyes tracking a hawk circling high above. None of us feel like we belong at first. We're all just people until the moment calls for us to be something more. You don't become a hero in a training exercise. You become a hero when you decide to keep going, when everyone else has sat down. Right now, you're just learning how to not sit down. Right now, you're just learning how to not sit down. The boy looked at Arthur's arm, where the faded trident tattoo was visible beneath his rolled-up sleeve. "Did you ever want to quit, sir?" Arthur let out a dry, short laugh. "Every single day, especially the days when it rained. But then I'd look at the man to my left and the man to my right, and I realized they were waiting for me to keep moving so they could move too. That's the only secret there is. Don't worry about the finish line. Just worry about the next step." The sailor stood up, a new light in his eyes. He didn't salute this time. He just nodded, a genuine human connection made between a legend and a beginner. "Next step. Got it. Thank you, Mr. Arthur." As the weeks turned into months, Arthur's basement became an unofficial sanctuary. It started with a few instructors coming down to ask about a plumbing issue, only to end up staying for an hour to listen to Arthur talk about the importance of mental focus or the history of the units they were now joining. He never told war stories to brag. He told them as lessons, mistakes he had made, friends he had lost, and the quiet pride of doing a job well. Even the commander who had first recognized him became a frequent visitor. He didn't come as a superior officer. He came as a student. They would sit on mismatched stools, drinking coffee out of stained mugs, discussing the philosophy of leadership. The commander once asked Arthur why he chose to stay in maintenance when he could have been a consultant making 10 times the money. Arthur looked at his workbench, at the tools that had become his best friends. "In the jungle, everything was about destruction," he said quietly. "We went in to break things. We went in to stop things. I spent the first half of my life taking things apart. I wanted to spend the second half putting things back together. There's a lot of healing in fixing a broken pipe, Commander. It's quiet work. It's honest." The story of the maintenance legend eventually reached the highest levels of the Navy. There was talk of a formal ceremony at the Pentagon, a chance to finally give Arthur the public recognition he had walked away from in 1975. When Henderson, the superintendent, brought the news down to the basement, Arthur didn't even look up from the motor he was cleaning. "Tell them thank you," Arthur said, "but tell them I'm busy." The air conditioning in the barracks is shot, and those kids shouldn't have to sleep in the heat. Henderson smiled, shaking his head. I figured you'd say that. I figured you'd say that. I already told them you were unavailable for operational reasons. The story ends on a quiet Friday evening. The base was settling into the weekend lull. Arthur packed his toolbox and walked to his truck. As he drove toward the gate, he saw a group of new recruits jogging in formation. As his battered truck passed them, the lead instructor called out a command. The entire formation stopped. They turned toward the road and snapped a crisp, synchronized salute as the rust-colored pickup rattled past. Arthur didn't feel like a ghost anymore. He didn't feel the need to hide. He reached a hand out the window and gave a simple wave, the wave of a man who was finally at peace with his past and his present. He drove off the base and onto the main highway, the sun setting behind him. He wasn't just Arthur the maintenance man, and he wasn't just the legend of the deep. He was a man who had found the greatest secret of all, that true greatness isn't found in the medals you keep in a box, but in the lives you touch while you're simply doing your job. He pulled into his small driveway, walked into his quiet house, and set his keys on the table. For the first time in 40 years, when he looked in the mirror to wash the grease off his face, he didn't see a man who was hiding. He saw a man who was home.